Thanks for watching this video from the Bible Fulfilled. My name's Alex Polyak. I am the director of the Bible Fulfilled. And today I'm going to be talking about the fulfillment of Daniel 12. This is the famous prophecy about the time of the end. And many Christian commentators say that this prophecy still needs to be fulfilled. But I think the biblical and the historical evidence clearly shows that it was fulfilled in the first century. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. Okay, so I'm not going to read the entire chapter because it's pretty long, but basically Daniel 12 talks about the Great Tribulation. In Daniel 12 verse 1 it says, "And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was, since there was a nation even to that time." So that's talking about the Great Tribulation. Daniel 12 also talks about the time of the end. It also mentions time, times, and half a time. In verse 7, it also talks about the end of daily sacrifices in verse 11. And it also talks about the abomination of desolation. So these are some of the things that Daniel 12 said would happen during this time period, during the time of the end. But here's the interesting part. Jesus in the Olivet Discourse alluded to these things, and he said they would happen within his generation. Here's a comparison of what Daniel said in Daniel 12 to what Jesus said in the Olivet Discourse. Both mention the time of the end. Actually, Jesus doesn't specifically use the words time of the end. Jesus says end of the age. But, you know, I think just about all commentators that I've ever read, in fact, all commentators that I've ever read agree that, you know, they're talking about the same end. So both talk about the time of the end. Both also talk about the Great Tribulation. In fact, both say it would be the worst event that ever was for Israel. And then Jesus adds in Matthew 24 verse 21 that it is the worst event that ever will be for Israel. Both also talk about the end of sacrifices. Actually, Jesus specifically mentions the destruction of the temple, which essentially means sacrifices would end. Without a temple, there can't be any sacrifices. Both also talk about the abomination of desolation. Daniel talked about this in Daniel 12 verse 11, then Jesus talked about it in Matthew 24 verse 15. And in fact, right after mentioning the abomination of desolation, Jesus specifically adds, quote, "as spoken by Daniel." So it doesn't get much clearer than this. Jesus is obviously, you know, alluding to Daniel's prophecy. Now, when did Jesus say all these things would happen? Jesus goes on to say in Matthew 24, verse 34, "Assuredly I say to you," and he's talking to his disciples here, "this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." So Jesus said all these things would happen within his generation. A biblical generation, by the way, equates to around 40 years. You can read this in Hebrews 3, verse 8 to 10, or Numbers 14, verse 30 to 34. Or Nehemiah 9, verse 21. So a biblical generation equals 40 years. Jesus gave the Olivet Discourse in approximately the year 8030. Therefore, all these events, according to Jesus, must have happened by around the year 8070. And they did happen, by the way. Now, let me look at the historical evidence showing this. Okay, so regarding the time of the end or the end of the age, contrary to what many Christians say, the time of the end does not refer to the end of time. Let me repeat this. The time of the end does not refer to the end of time. There's not a single passage anywhere in the Bible that speaks of the end of time. But the Bible does talk about the time of the end. There's a big difference, though. And what does the time of the end refer to? The time of the end of the Old Covenant age. And when would the Old Covenant age end? Well, according to the writer of Hebrews, and the writer of Hebrews said this in approximately the year 8062, so about 8 years prior to the destruction of the temple, he said, quote, in that he says a new covenant, and he is God here. So in that he, God, says a new covenant, he has made the first covenant obsolete. Now it is becoming obsolete and growing old, is ready to vanish away. This is Hebrews 8, verse 13. So the old covenant age was about to vanish away when this passage was written in approximately the year AD 62. The writer of Hebrews also says in Hebrews 9, verse 8 to 9, that the temple that was standing in that time period, Herod's temple, that temple symbolized the Old Covenant age. So when that temple was destroyed in AD 70, then that meant the Old Covenant age had officially ended. So the time of the end refers to the time of the end of the Old Covenant age, and the Old Covenant age officially passed away when the temple was destroyed in the year AD 70. This timing also fits well with Paul saying in approximately the year AD 57, the ends of the ages have come. So when Paul said this in the year AD 57, the ends of the ages had come. This also fits well with Peter saying in approximately the year AD 63, the end of all things is at hand. Now, when Peter said the end of all things, I think he's referring to the end of all things related to the Old Covenant age, because obviously we're still here 2,000 years later. So I think Peter was obviously referring to the end of all things related to the Old Covenant age, and it was at hand when Peter said this. So the time of the end refers to the time of the end of the Old Covenant age, which officially passed away when the temple was destroyed in the year AD 70. Okay, now let me talk about the Great Tribulation. Daniel talks about this in Daniel 12, verse 1, and then Jesus talks about it in Matthew 24, verse 21. Like I already said, Jesus said in approximately AD 30 that the Great Tribulation would happen within a generation, within his generation. And here's the interesting part. By the time Revelation was written, about 35 years later, so in approximately the year AD 65, when Revelation was written, the tribulation had already begun, according to John, the writer of Revelation. John says, quote, he was a brother and companion in the tribulation. This is Revelation 1, verse 9. So John says the tribulation had already begun. And this is the tribulation Jesus said would happen within a generation. It had already begun 35 years later when John wrote Revelation. The first century historian Josephus also confirms that the tribulation happened during this time period in the first century. Josephus said more than 1.1 million Jews were slaughtered, another 97,000 were taken into slavery. In fact, Josephus said that no other people had suffered so much as the Jews. Here's a couple quotes from Josephus about this. The first is this. It says, it appears to me that the misfortunes of all men from the beginning of the world, if they be compared to those of the Jews, are not so considerable as they were. This makes it impossible for me to contain my lamentations. So Josephus essentially says that no other people suffered so much as the Jews. And keep in mind, Josephus witnessed all these events. He lived in the area during this time period. In fact, Josephus was a devout Jew of priestly descent who led the Jewish military forces against the Romans. His forces were eventually defeated by the Roman general Vespasian in the year AD 67. The two military leaders eventually became friends after Josephus interpreted an oracle to mean Vespasian would become emperor of Rome. Josephus then became infatuated with all things Roman, even changing his name from the very Jewish-sounding Joseph ben Matthias to the more Roman Flavius Josephus, taking on Flavius Vespasian's name as his benefactor. Vespasian, who did in fact become the Roman emperor in AD 69, just like Josephus had said, sponsored the writing of the War of the Jews, which, documented the Jewish-Roman War of AD 67 to 70. And Josephus wrote this approximately 5 years after the fall of Jerusalem. So Josephus witnessed all these events, and as I read in the previous quote, he said, no other people have ever suffered so much as the Jews during this tribulation. In another quote about this time period, Josephus said, it is therefore impossible to go distinctly over every instance of these men's iniquity. I shall therefore speak my mind here once briefly, that neither did any other city ever suffer such miseries, nor did any age ever breed a generation more fruitful in wickedness than this was from the beginning of the world. So this was a bad time for Jews. God was paying them back for killing the Messiah and persecuting Jesus's disciples. And in fact, God was also paying them back for their long history of killing the prophets. You can read about this in the parable of the wicked vine dressers in Matthew 21, verse 33 to 36. I'm sorry, 33 to 46. So this was the great tribulation that Jesus and Daniel prophesied about, and it happened in the first century. And remember how Daniel described this as time, times, and half a time, as I just pointed out a second ago. As just about all commentators acknowledge, this refers to a 3.5 year time period. Time equals a year, times equals 2 years, and then half a time equals a half a year. So that equals 3.5 years. And how long did the first Jewish-Roman war last? Exactly 3.5 years. This war began in the spring of AD 67 with the Jewish revolt, and it culminated in September AD 70 with the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. So this was the time, times, and half a time that Daniel 12 described. Okay, so now let me move on to end of sacrifices, which is mentioned in Daniel 12, verse 11. Also, Jesus talked about it in Matthew 24, verse 1 to 2. As I already mentioned, Jesus mentioned the destruction of the temple, which essentially means end of sacrifices. Now, I think this probably happened, according to Daniel 12, it happened probably prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. But in any case, sacrifices ended in that generation, in that time period, just like both Daniel and Jesus said. Okay, now regarding the abomination of desolation, Daniel mentions this in Daniel 12, verse 11. Jesus also mentions it in Matthew 24, verse 15. We can pinpoint exactly when this abomination of desolation happened by comparing Matthew's account of the Olivet Discourse to Luke's account of the Olivet Discourse. In both accounts, Jesus is talking to his disciples, that were standing right in front of him in the first century. And in Matthew's account, Jesus says, and this is Matthew 24, verse 15 to 16, Jesus says, quote, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel standing in the holy place, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, end quote. Now, in Luke's account, Jesus says, when you see, and this is Luke 21, verse 21 to, Luke 21, verse 20 to 21. And in Luke's account, he says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So both accounts begin with when you see. However, because Luke was talking to Gentiles who would have not been familiar with the term abomination of desolation, Luke made it easier for his audience to understand by simply saying, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then flee. But because Matthew was writing to Jews who would have been very familiar with the term abomination of desolation from the book of Daniel, so Matthew said, but when you see the abomination of desolation, then flee. So both, though, are talking about the same event. I mean, it's obvious because Jesus said, when you see this, then flee. And Jesus also confirms in both accounts of the Olivet Discourse, in Luke's version and in Matthew's version, that it would happen within his generation. So it's obviously the same event. So the abomination of desolation happened in Jesus's generation, per Jesus. Now, what does the abomination of desolation specifically refer to? I think it refers to the first century Jews. they were the abomination that caused God to desolate the temple. That's what abomination of desolation literally means, by the way. The abomination that causes desolation. So I think the Jews were the abomination that caused God to desolate the temple. In fact, Jesus gives a scathing rebuke of the Jews of his day in Matthew 23. He calls them everything from fools to murderers to whitewashed tombs to blind guides to broods of vipers. And let's not forget, these Jews also crucified their Messiah. Technically, the Romans killed Jesus, but they did it at the behest of the Jews, and you can read this in Luke 23, verse 21, and in John 1, verse 11. So these Jews, pushed for the killing of their Messiah. These Jews also persecuted Jesus' disciples, to no end. So the Jews of Jesus' day were the abomination that caused God to desolate the temple. This was the abomination of desolation. There's another view of the abomination of desolation that I'll quickly go over. I don't hold this view, but some people do, so I'll mention it. Some commentators say the abomination of desolation refers to the Roman armies. During the Jewish-Roman War of AD 67 to 70, the Roman armies, as they were destroying the temple, they walked around the outer courts of the temple with their pagan symbols lifted high, and they offered sacrifices to their pagan gods. So some commentators say that these Roman soldiers were the abomination that caused God to desolate the temple or destroy the temple. Another view of the abomination of desolation, I don't hold this view either, but I'll mention it just the same, is that the abomination of desolation refers to the Jewish zealots who obtained possession of the temple just prior to its destruction. The Jewish zealots obtained possession approximately the year AD 67 to 68. These Jewish zealots made the holy place, or the most holy place in the temple, a garrison and stronghold of their tyrannous and lawless rule, while the better priests looked on from afar and wept tears of horror, according to a quote from Gary DeMar's book, End Times Fiction. So some commentators say these Jewish zealots were the abomination that caused God to desolate the temple. So there are different views of the abomination of desolation. I think it was the Jews of that time period, but whoever it was, we can be 100% sure it happened in the first century for the reasons that I listed a minute ago. So all these events talked about in Daniel 12 happened in the first century. So this is when Daniel 12 was fulfilled. Now there's an important objection I want to go over. Some people say that Daniel 12 could not have been fulfilled in the first century because Daniel 12 also talks about the resurrection. In Daniel 12 verse 2 it says, "And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt." This is Daniel 12 verse 2. So some Christians say that Daniel 12 could not have been fulfilled in the first century because Daniel 12 also talks about the resurrection happening. I disagree, and I think Jesus and Paul would too. And here's why. Jesus and Paul both said the resurrection had already begun in their time period. Here's what Jesus said in John 5, verse 25. "Most assuredly I say to you, the hour is coming, and now is." So this was happening already. Jesus said, "And now is, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live." So this is a reference to resurrection. And Jesus said that the time now is when he was, alive during his earthly ministry. So this is referring to, spiritual resurrection. And Jesus said it was already happening in his time period. Paul said something similar. Paul said in Ephesians 2, verse 5 to 6, quote, "Even when we were dead in trespasses, God made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and raised us up together and made us sit in the heavenly places in Jesus Christ." So Paul says that the Christians in his day were raised up. This is a reference to resurrection. It's a spiritual resurrection, and it was already happening in Paul's day. In another passage, Paul says, this is from Colossians 3, verse 1 to 2, "If then you were raised with Christ," so notice this is past tense, if then you were raised with Christ, so this is referring to resurrection, seek those things which are above, where Christ is sitting at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on things on the earth, for you died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. So this is referring to resurrection. It's spiritual, and it was already happening in the first century. So the resurrection that Daniel prophesied in Daniel 12 had already begun in Jesus's and Paul's day. So I think this event was fulfilled in the first century. Now, there's a lot more I could say about resurrection. I don't want to make this video too long, though. But anyway, I already made a bunch of videos on resurrection, so I'll put links to those videos in the video notes below if you're interested, so you can check those out. There are also some other events mentioned in Daniel 12 that I've talked about elsewhere, so I'm not going to talk about it in this video, such as the increase of knowledge and the power of the holy people being shattered. Daniel 12 talks about both of these things, the increase of knowledge and the power of the holy people being shattered. So I've written about these topics too, so I'm not going to repeat it here in this video, but if you're interested, I'll leave a link to those articles in the video notes below too, so if you're interested, check that out. Okay, so I think Daniel 12 clearly was fulfilled in the first century. All the events that Daniel 12 talks about, you know, there's biblical evidence that these events happen, and there's also historical evidence that these events happen. Okay, so that is it for today. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please do me a huge favor. Hit the like button. Also, if you want to be notified of new videos, hit the subscribe button. And for a more detailed discussion about the topics discussed in this video, get my book called The End is Here, How the New Testament's Prophecies Were Fulfilled. I go into much more detail about these topics. I also talk about many other end time related topics like the passing of heaven and earth, and the resurrection, the second coming, the elements shall burn with fervent heat. I also talk about the book of Revelation. In fact, I have a whole chapter dedicated to Revelation. So if you're interested in eschatology or end time stuff, get my book. It's available on Amazon. Okay, so thanks again for watching, and I will see you next time.